Hey guys, Jester here. Today I'm going to be reading you a story from Dragon Magazine 187. It is titled Dragon Scales. It's a comical little story, so let's get right to it. By the way, it's by Eric Tanafon. St. George's Day had come round again, and the village of Hurtleburg put on its bravest colors. The people dressed in their Sunday best. A few actually bathed for the occasion, though the elders clucked and shook their heads. The villagers and their visitors, many arrived each spring to make a pilgrimage or place a wager, lined the crooked streets, craning their necks impatiently as vendors of wine and sweetmeats went to and fro. At last the procession of knights came into view. Their armor shone like the sun, and scrubbed faces beamed from beneath lifted visors as they waved to the villagers. King's sons, every one of them, and none a day over 20. The crowd cheered as the knights rode past. A beautiful maiden offered a bouquet to the last in line, a seventh son of a seventh son. He lifted the flowers on the tip of his lance, ostentatiously inhaling their fragrance, and called back to her, "I'll see you tonight." The onlookers raised a last ragged cheer as the procession vanished into a cloud of dust. Then they dispersed to their homes, leaving only the maiden, Emelinda, gazing longingly after the knights. Later that afternoon, the dragon's hissing roar filled the whole valley. Soon after, it stilled. People exchanged hopeful glances. They gathered again in the main square. But soon, one of the knight's horses returned, riderless, smelling of singed hair. Then another. 13 knights had set out. 13 horses came back. Night fell. The villagers gathered at Hurtleburg's best tavern, the Tin Ear. They discussed the latest failure with a resigned air. The innkeeper, Johann, a fat man with a handlebar mustache, showed better cheer than his customers. He had insisted that the knights pay in advance. In her cave in the foothills, several miles off, the dragon too felt melancholy. She arranged the empty suits of armor against a wall and studied them with lamp-like eyes. No new ones in this batch. She buried them in the main cavern with the bones, kicking dirt over with her hind legs like a large dog. Then she withdrew to the smaller inner cave that housed her collection. She never tired of looking at the armor she'd saved from years past. Strange, she thought, that these creatures had both an internal skeleton and an exoskeleton. She knew of no others that did. And such variety in their outer shells. They didn't seem to evolve from year to year, exactly, but they did change. Some were smooth and silvery, others bumpy and covered with spikes. A few of the older ones were splotched with rust. The creature's behavior, too, filled her with wonder. Why, every spring, did a batch of them show up at her cave just when she was beginning to feel hungry? She knew of lemmings and suspected that humans suffered from a similar compulsion to periodically hurl themselves to certain doom. Overpopulation, perhaps. Dragons, she thought, handled the matter much more sensibly. Only one egg in 100 hatched, and the adults spread themselves far and wide, one to a mountain at most. A belch rose to her throat, interrupting her reverie. She had made a heavy meal that day. She crawled hastily to the entrance of the cavern and opened her mouth, igniting the sky. "We've got to do something about this." Rudolph Tonner, Hurtleburg's mayor, banged his stein down like a gavel. 4 men, the pillars of village society, were gathered around the hearth at the Tin Ear, a fire more cheerful than the dragon's to warm them. Spieler, chief of the constabulary, scowled. "It's a breakdown of law and order." "Hurtleburg's become a laughingstock," agreed Virgil Kampf, schoolmaster of the village's only school, which at present boasted 7 pupils. "Worst of all, gentlemen," pronounced the merchant Geltfager, "it's bad for business." He emptied his tankard, wiped foam from his lips, and signaled for another. "It's gotten so I can't go to guild meetings any more," he continued. "You should hear them. Hurtleburg, oh, yes, very quaint, charming medieval atmosphere, but really a dragon? That's carrying period restoration a shade too far. No, I will put my money in Wellstade, where they have just built a new clock tower. And we may be losing one of the only things that does attract business, observed Kampf, to wit, our St. George's Day celebration. I knew we'd run out of king's sons at some point, Mayor Tonner remarked gloomily. The knights are beginning to balk. No one ever coming back, and that sort of thing. The schoolmaster blinked apologetically behind his thick spectacles. They're saying that true knighthood may have more to do with clean living than flashy deeds of daring do. Community service, carrying food baskets to elderly widows. They also point out that the dragon hasn't eaten any maidens yet, at least as far as we can tell. Wasn't the disappearance of Christina, the baker's daughter, linked to the dragon? Spieler asked, furrowing his brow. Dragon? More likely a dragoon, Tonner snorted. So the knights are off the hook, Kampf concluded glumly. They say they won't be back next year. I'll be the first to go broke, predicted Tonner. The rest of you will follow soon enough. We'll all have to move to the capital where there are no dragons, unless you count the Empress. And Hurtleburg will become a ghost town, Geltfager said mournfully. A new voice interrupted the melancholy conversation. Some of us aren't ghosts yet. What are the lot of you doing with such long faces? I won't have it, not in my tavern. God gave us drink to make us glad. Hilda Broomfast, chief barmaid at the Tin Ear, and the fifth most indispensable pillar of Hurtleburg society, stood over them with arms akimbo. She was comfortably rounded and comfortably middle-aged. Though her hair was streaked with gray, her shrewd, honest face showed few lines. She glanced from one man to the next. Come now, if you really had any faith in the knights, you're worse off than I thought. In 7 years, have they ever managed even to dent the dragon's scales? No. Well, there you are. Good riddance to 'em. If you ask me, it was the wrong approach. When you want a dragon to cooperate, you don't wave a sword at it. That gets their temper up every time. What we need is someone who can charm the dragon. The men looked up hopefully. What are you suggesting? Tonner asked. Not my own services, to be sure, Hilda batted her eyelashes. My mother knew a spell or two. My only secret potion is the one you're drinking. But remember, that story came out of Hamlin in my grandmother's time, the one about a piper who'd rid the town of rats? Of course, Kampf exclaimed, smacking his forehead. Music hath charms to soothe the savage beast, or something like that. And in the old myths, Orpheus made even trees dance to his lute. Gentlemen, it could work, pronounced Geltfager solemnly. I think I know a man who would do. A minstrel from the capital. I met him at a court function last spring, Tonner said briskly. He raised his stein to Hilda. Hurtleburg is in your debt. How can we repay you? Hilda stroked her chin thoughtfully. Why don't we wait and see what you have to pay me back with? As an artist, Elaine, the minstrel, was always willing to try new things, to experiment. It didn't particularly matter that he didn't believe in dragons. He didn't believe in noble kings, or enchanted maidens either, but he sang about them. They were his stock in trade, and for the payment that Hurtleburg has offered, he would have been willing to sing a duet with a mermaid or play a one-night stand in a fairy hill. Ropes woven of gold are strong enough to suspend almost any amount of disbelief. Still, as he awakened in his room upstairs at the Tin Ear, he felt a twinge of unease. There were, after all, those knights who had never returned. They rose up in his mind's eye, awkward, clanking ghosts, haloed with dragon's fire, their foretaste of hell. But the morning was sunny and warm. Leaf-scented air drifted in through his window. He soon forgot his fears. His mind was busy with professional considerations. What to play for the dragon hunt? Something like Greensleeves, to put the beast in a nostalgic and presumably gentle mood? A funeral dirge for the hundreds of knights that had vanished down the dragon's maw? Or a lively, cheerful march, Elaine striding before, the beast following, until he led it into some mountain lake to quench its fire? Elaine grinned, shaking his head. He'd just have to decide on the spur of the moment. Luckily, he'd always been good at improvising. He got up, stretching luxuriously. "Frederick!" he shouted. His apprentice scrambled to his feet with a grunt, rubbing his eyes. "The sun is up. the minstrel told him. "No time to waste. I'm told dragons are sluggish in the early morning. Cold blood, you know." "Master," Frederick's face was anguished, "what about breakfast?" Elaine shook his head firmly. "Dragons, my lad, have this in common with life's other distasteful tasks. They are best faced on an empty stomach." Elaine dressed in leisurely fashion, having sent Frederick downstairs to inquire as to their way. When the youth returned, he bade him to take up the great harp. Elaine himself would carry the lute, having no wish to appear hunchbacked, especially before the crowds of townspeople that would be seeing him off. They clambered down the stairs, finding that the inn was waking up. Cheerful smells drifted in from the kitchen, and a few early drinkers were already deep into their morning mugs. Frederick halted with a plaintive look at Elaine, but the minstrel motioned him on. "Master, even a condemned man is not refused a last breakfast." "Ah, but you are not condemned, Frederick," Elaine said lightly. "You are about to become famous, and rich as well. Wave to the crowds now, and look cheerful." But no crowds awaited them. Elaine looked up and down the street in disbelief. Sunlight against stained walls, a fly buzzing here and there, a dog nosing around the cobblestones. That was all, until Hilda appeared at the side door of the inn, waving a handkerchief. Elaine waved back. "So much for fame," he muttered. "Ah, well, Frederick, off we go like thieves in the morning." At the outskirts of town, one person waited for them. Emelinda, eyes modestly downcast, stood there smiling shyly and offering a bunch of forget-me-nots. She wore a flat, flowing white dress, looking like a bride who had been left behind by the rest of the wedding party. Elaine swaggered up to her. "For me, my pretty maiden?" he asked. She nodded. "For luck, my lord. For your safe return." He accepted the bouquet, handing the lute to Frederick. "They smell so sweet, my fair one, that almost they rival your own perfume. How came you to know when we would set out? The rest of the town seems uninformed." "I always know when someone is going to the dragon," she answered. Her voice was breathy as the lower notes of a flute. "I have the second sight. It runs in my family." "Sir!" Frederick began to hop from one foot to the other. "Silence, lout!" Elaine turned a withering glance on his servant. "What, in such a hurry now to be gone? Stand still so you don't put my harp out of tune with your St. Vitus dance." He turned back to Emelinda. "Your pardon, fairest. I will carry your favor with me, come what may. Here and now I swear eternal fealty to you, my love, my muse." He dropped to one knee, kissing her outstretched hand. Then he rose, dusting his breeches carefully, and took his leave of Emelinda with a last melting glance. Frederick followed in his wake, cursing softly and with a total lack of imagination. Emelinda smiled as she walked back to town, the sort of smile possible only for a maiden who has heard scores of knights swear eternal love and is a maiden still. "She's a carrion crow, I tell you," said Frederick hotly, as they kicked up dust on the path winding up to the mountain's lower slopes. "I'd trade her for any caged parakeet in the capital," his master said dreamily. "She smelled our death. That's why she came, with flowers to lay on our graves." "No more, Frederick. The subject is closed." Elaine smelled the flowers once more, then handed them to his apprentice. He glanced around. The sun had climbed halfway up the sky, but the forest around them was strangely silent. The minstrel frowned. When had the sounds of birdsong, the chatter of squirrels ceased? The dragon no longer seemed so mythical. "We must be getting close," he murmured. Frederick, too, fell silent, ceasing his curses as they entered the circle of stillness that surrounded the dragon's cavern. There was not so much a sense of desolation here, thought Elaine, as one of hushed respect. Most of the trees remained intact, although some showed scorch marks on their trunks, or had a branch or two burned away. Even there, one didn't get the feeling of wanton destruction. This might be simply the way the dragon marked its territory. "So," Elaine said to himself, "this increasingly probable dragon is perhaps not wholly a ravening beast. It might, after all, respond to music, though it can't be used to hearing much in that line, with all the songbirds staying away." As if in answer to his thought, a flight of ravens settled down on a tree beside the path and began to croak. Frederick made the sign of the cross with a shaking hand. "Death bird, sir!" "Give me back that lute," snapped the minstrel. "I'll need it soon. Steady yourself, man." A few hundred yards further on and up, They emerged into a large clearing, and the cavern of the dragon was behind them, or before them. Nothing grew near the entrance. Packed dirt showed the faint prints of monstrous claws. The rocks around the cavern's mouth had been worn smooth by the passage of the dragon's body. Elaine gazed for a long time, trying to memorize every detail. This would make a ballad that would live long beyond his own time, if he survived. He walked forward a few paces while Frederick hung back, casting desperate glances at the sky and the forest behind. Elaine cleared his throat, adjusted the tuning pegs, and began to play a song he had learned in Spain. He sang in a sweet tenor about the sadness of the last of the Moors, leaving behind the beautiful Spanish countryside and the palaces they had built there. To Frederick it seemed that the sun stood still, in rapt attention as Elaine played. A few songbirds flew into the clearing and perched, twittering, in nearby trees, wondering either at the song itself or the effrontery of the man who played it. The dragon answered. A loud snort came from inside the cavern, as if the beast had been rudely awakened. Then came the grinding, clashing noise of a body covered with brazen scales dragging itself toward the entrance. Elaine played on, dispatching a last hasty prayer, which fluttered away into the sky with the departing songbirds. The dragon's head appeared at the cavern's mouth, for all the world like a fair maiden showing herself on the balcony in response to a serenade. It blinked in the bright sunlight. Then it saw Elaine, and its eyes, big as dinner plates, snapped wide open. It edged forward until its forelegs emerged, and lay resting its head on them, looking thoughtful. The dragon was not particularly hungry, and she didn't think that the man looked very threatening. He was some sort of novel, dishevelled variety, too. But what was that awful noise he was making? Elaine could not help but feel this was the finest hour of his career. He stood there, flawlessly managing the complex chord changes Montello's had taught him in Granada, while a live dragon, wisps of smoke curling from its nostrils, lay enchanted before him. A sound behind him made him turn his head, though his fingers didn't cease to weave their tapestry of sound. He was just in time to see the harp bobbing up and down of Frederick's back as the youth took to his heels. Elaine shrugged inwardly. Better to die alone in such company as that, if die he must. And Melinda's image drifted gently through his mind. He finished the song with a flourish. The dragon gazed at him with an unfathomable expression in its yellow eyes. Elaine, greatly daring, doffed his hat and bowed. The dragon coughed. Flame filled the clearing. He had to jump backwards, feeling his face blister with heat. He beat at his smoldering doublet. "All right, Master Dragon. You didn't like that? Well, try another," he cried. Surprisingly, he felt no impulse to follow Frederick. Elaine had always known himself to be a vain person, but it seemed that in certain circumstances vanity might appear as, or even magically become, courage. He would re-enchant the dragon, or die trying, and let something else write the ballad. Or someone else write the ballad. He began a lively folk tune from the Black Forest. After a few bars, the dragon growled. A hot wind slammed into the minstrel's face. He stopped short in confusion. The dragon hauled its full length from the cavern, revealing a whip-like tail, thick as a man's thigh, sweeping restlessly back and forth. The earth shook under Elaine's feet. He considered flight. Bravery had its limits, but knew it was useless. The dragon could incinerate him before he'd gone 10 paces. The ravens had followed him up. He saw now, and watched from the surrounding trees like a dark jury. Waiting to finish what's left of my carcass, he thought. The air filled with their croaking calls, wiping any memory of song from his mind. The dragon raised its head momentarily, listening. Elaine gasped as a wild idea came to him. The dragon began to circle him, head lowered, gnashing its rows of knife-like teeth. Elaine worked quickly, retuning the lute's strings. Some of them loosened, flapped and buzzed in tones almost too low to hear. He tightened others until they emitted a continual high hum without even being touched. One string broke with a forlorn twang, stinging his cheek. Then he played, and once again the world held its breath to hear. The retuned lute sounded like a cat and a bullfrog fighting to the death. Elaine's instrument sobbed, wrangled, croaked painfully, screamed in discordance like a choir of the damned. And the dragon cocked her head to listen. Then the beast lay down, looked closely at the minstrel, and, politely keeping her flames in check, answered. Cracked bells, small animals being tortured, a grand piano being pushed down a flight of stairs. Elaine listened carefully. He made some minor adjustments to the tuning pegs. Then he played again, a similar phrase, sounding like a small, nasal echo of the dragon's voice. They stayed there throughout the whole afternoon. The ravens flew over them, croaking gleefully in celebration of dissonance, while the songbirds huddled together, far away in a different part of the forest. There was, in fact, a crowd waiting when Elaine walked back into town, singed but victorious. Emelinda had seen to that. She had known of his return even before Frederick reappeared at the inn, babbling about Dragonfire. That night the village feasted. Tonner and Geltfager, who had kept the news of Elaine's arrival quiet, not wanting to bear the blame for another failure, spared no expense now. The roasts, cakes, and wine were of the finest quality, and there was a barrel after barrel of dark Hurtlebug beer. Virgil Kampf and an unusually jovial Spieler propped each other up in a corner, shouting bawdy songs. Hilda Broomfast was more quietly elated. Tonner was feeling expansive, and her reward had been enough gold marks to set her up in business for herself. She sat smiling, thinking of putting her feet up while someone else fetched mugs out to the customers. Frederick sulked upstairs. He had counted on caging free drinks with tales of his narrow escape, but Elaine's success had ruined his story. The minstrel kept Amelinda close by his side. At one point he had Tonner call for silence and stood up with her to announce their wedding. All congratulated him and the blushing Amelinda, and fell to even more furious merrymaking. Having at the same time lost a dragon and gained a bard, a new age had dawned for the village. "But how did you know how to talk to the monster?" Tonner asked much later. The fire had sunk to glowing coals, and most of the villagers, unused to celebrations, had long since gone to bed. Elaine shrugged modestly. "It was easy, really. I noticed that the dragon tolerated ravens near her home, while the sweet singers fled from her. This led me to think that dragons have an aesthetic difference from our own, which I strove to satisfy." He paused to pluck a few notes on his ruined lute, and the listeners winced. "But I was surprised to find," the minstrel went on, "that dragons actually speak a language of pure tones, discordant as it might be to our ears. Incidentally, this supports those legends about their having come from out of the east. The language of Cathay, I'm told, uses tones in this fashion. I'm still working on the fine points, though the dragon and I have reached a basic understanding. But then there will be plenty of time to get to know dragon speech better." "Plenty of—" Tonner started. "What do you mean? Our agreement was that you would charm the dragon away from Hurtleberg forever." Hilda gave the mayor a scandalized look. "And why would the beast leave her home? She's lived here longer than any of us." "True," Elaine nodded, "and I've only learned how to speak with the dragon, not how to command her, but we did strike a bargain." "What bargain?" asked Tonner helplessly. "She has agreed to waive the yearly tribute of knights." A choking sound escaped Spieler. Elaine smiled graciously. "Yes, it took some diplomacy. I can see why you wanted someone from the capital for this undertaking. She has agreed, as I say, to accept other sustenance, which the villagers will supply. A matter of 2 or 3 cows a month, no more. To make things easier on everyone, she will take up residence in the town square." The mayor opened his mouth but made no sound. Elaine nodded. "Exactly. Every merchant in town will profit. We'll have visitors from all over the empire, and it will be good for the dragon as well. They're solitary creatures, but she's grown lonely over the centuries. She wants to learn more about us, now that she knows we're not dumb beasts." "Why don't you give us that ballad you've been composing?" suggested Amelinda innocently. "The one with the refrain in the dragon's tongue?" The mayor, a good politician, knew when to cut his losses. "Don't touch the lute," he cried. "I decree that it will hang on the wall of the inn from now on as a reminder of this historic day. And now raise your glasses once more, my friends, to the dragon and to our good fortune." Away, deep in the night, the dragon heard this merrymaking and roared in answer, flame streaking the sky like a falling star. Then, content, she went back to the task of gathering her 100 eggs for the move into town. So there you have it, guys. Dragon Scales from Dragon Magazine 187. I hope you enjoyed that rather comical tale as much as I did. Make sure you hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell, and make sure you share with all your friends. And until next time, and as always, see you soon.